Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. In today's episode, I'm taking a closer look at the Voigtländer Perkeo II, which is a purely mechanical 6x6 medium format folder camera. We have reviewed the Perkeo I before on this channel, but for some reason I got recently bitten by the bug and wanted to explore the Perkeo II as well, and I found an inexpensive one and purchased it, and it came in the condition that I kind of expected. It was pretty dirty, it smelled like a camera smells if it had been stored in a basement or similar for a very long time. But my friend Jules was kind enough to disassemble it, to clean it properly, basically do an entire CLA on the camera, and now it looks and works like new again. So he basically saved the camera. And then the question is, okay, if you already have a Perkeo I, why do you want to get a Perkeo II? Most importantly, you have the same 6x6 negative, so a rather large format for a relatively compact and small camera. Then you have a fantastic 80mm f3.5 lens, a Color-Skopar that is built into the camera, fixed lens. And you have a Synchro-Compur shutter with a relatively nice shutter speed range from 1/500th of a second to half a second plus a bulb mode. And the main difference between the first iteration and the second iteration of these cameras is that here you have an automatic frame counter and a double exposure prevention mechanism, and all these mechanisms are completely mechanical. And it basically means in practice that, in contrast to the Perkeo I, where you always had to open the red window at the back to look at the backing paper of your film when advancing it and wait for the next number to come in, here you only do that when putting in the film, putting it to 1, and afterwards you can close the window and simply advance the film, because the camera understands when the next frame will be there, and it also prevents you from pressing the shutter release button if you have already exposed that particular frame. So pretty advanced mechanical mechanism, and I was curious about understanding and experiencing that mechanism, and also getting the added convenience of the Perkeo II over the Perkeo I. And I recently did a trip to California, a longer one, that included visits of the Sequoia and Yosemite National Parks and Carmel by the Sea. And I knew in advance when planning the trip that I wanted to shoot some landscape images, ideally exposing some medium format film. And I was thinking of which camera could I possibly bring to such a trip that would enable me to shoot medium format, but also not bring a particularly large and heavy camera on a 5-hour hike through Yosemite Park, for instance. And I ended up deciding to take the Perkeo II with me, and I don't regret this decision at all. I get beautiful results out of it, and of course I can't wait to share them with you. As always, these films were developed and scanned by my trusted on-film lab in Frankfurt, and yeah, let's dive in there. The Voigtländer Perkeo II is a medium format 6x6 folding camera that was produced in West Germany between 1952 and 1955. Its main features are the 80mm f3.5 Color-Skopar lens that is simply amazing and creates fantastic sharpness across the entire frame, and the very reliable Synchro-Compur shutter with speeds ranging from 1/500th of a second to half a second plus a bulb mode. The lens is a coated 4-element lens that delivers incredible sharpness and quality, as mentioned, and some versions of the camera also came with a Prontor shutter instead of the Compur, but most of them came with that one. Interestingly, and as common for these kinds of cameras, the shutter always needs to be cocked before you can press the shutter release button, so you do that here with the little lever around the lens, typical for such a leaf shutter. And as mentioned in the introduction, the Perkeo II was the most user-friendly version of this particular camera because it had that automatic frame counter and the double exposure prevention mechanism. And it is all controlled via this little lever here at the back of the camera. If you turn it to the right, it's basically disengaging that mechanism, the counting mechanism and double exposure lock. So this is what you use to put in the film and then advance it to 1. And once you've done that and you have looked through the window, the red window at the back, and have advanced it to 1, you close that window, you turn that lever to the left, and that engages the counting mechanism where it goes from 1 up to 12 frames. And it also ensures that after having taken a shot on one of these frames, you cannot take another one on it, the double exposure prevention mechanism. That of course was a problem in the past when you always had to remember yourself on which frame you are, looking through that window at the back with the Perkeo I, and then when advancing the film, looking exactly that you advance it to the next number. And here you have equally spaced negatives. You don't have this problem anymore. You only look through it in the beginning and then you're good to go. And from a mechanical perspective, this is quite an achievement, and there's a lot of thought that was put into how this mechanism is supposed to be working, and that makes this whole mechanism also rather delicate. And I would highly encourage reading the manual for this particular camera, because otherwise it's very easy that you create a problem for yourself and you're not able anymore to either release the shutter or advance the film or open it up in the way it should be opened up, and you're messing up the entire process and mechanical understanding in the background if you don't read the manual carefully in this particular case. Obviously the camera does not have a built-in light meter and also no rangefinder or distance meter. So typically this is a camera where you would have either accessory or an accessory that does both, either a vintage or a modern one. And we had discussed the Qi light and distance meter before here on the channel, and this is also what I brought for this particular trip. I didn't even use the distance meter so much because most of the time I was simply focusing at infinity, shooting landscapes. But the built-in light meter, of course, was quite convenient to have that with me. Of course, I could have also taken a handheld one or just a light meter for putting it in the cold shoe, or having a classic traditional rangefinder on top. That's also possible. Personally, I settled on this particular integrated device that does both things pretty well, despite the fact that I only needed, or primarily needed, the light meter. What's also interesting is that the built-in viewfinder is surprisingly good. At least in my case, it worked wonderfully also for compositions. There are some people that prefer the external contour 6x6 finder as an accessory to improve the composition. That's of course also possible to put that in the cold shoe. And of course, as always, you can also just go back and just guess the distance and shoot with the Sunny 16 rule, and like that create a correct exposure and ideally an image that is in focus. Speaking of focus, there are also some presets on the lens, 3 different ones for different distances, for a group shot, for scenery, for portrait, and so on. Like that, you can also do zone focusing, but of course that only works properly if you're stopping down your lens enough. And since this is a 6x6 negative and you have a medium format camera with 80mm, you have a pretty shallow depth of field, and of course you should try to focus as correctly as possible to make sure that your subject will be in focus. The camera can be opened by pressing a button here on the bottom and then lifting out the lens, which is connected to a bellows. And of course you may also mount a flash on the camera's cold shoe and sync it using M or X flash, sync on the shutter. All the other settings are basically around the lens here. Here's where you can set not only the focusing distance, but also the aperture that you want to set, and of course the shutter speed, because here the leaf shutter is kind of built into that lens mechanism. On the bottom you only have a tripod socket and, as I said, that button to open it up, and you have that wheel to advance the frames. And you have the frame counter on top that I've already mentioned. And a shutter release button, and that's it. So a pretty straightforward, simple camera that, despite its features, was still considered a mid-level camera that was sitting below the more advanced Voigtländer Perkeo series at the time. So what about the image quality and results? Overall, the images turned out amazing and just as I intended them. I have a little bit of a small distracting element on the upper right corner, and I'm assuming this is coming from something inside of the camera that I didn't notice earlier. That's of course a little bit of a nuisance, but not too bad. But other than that, I get really nice results. What stands out the most to me is, for such a vintage lens, the kind of sharpness and resolution that it produces, even when shot wide open. So already at f3.5, you do have some corner fall off when it comes to the sharpness, and some vignetting, of course, but it's still relatively nice and sharp. And once you stop down just a little bit, you get amazing results across the entire frame. So really beautiful and sharp. The bokeh I found not particularly pleasing, to be honest. I didn't have a lot of images where I could test that because I typically shot at infinity, as I've mentioned. So there was only 1 or 2 shots where I was closer to my subject and focused on that, here in that particular case on the snow. And here you can see what I'm referring to when I say the bokeh is not particularly outstanding or beautiful. For me, it's fair and solid, but not something to write home about. What I particularly liked is the color reproduction of that particular lens in combination with the Kodak Gold 200. It gave it a really nice vintage flair. Maybe it was also the colors that we encountered in the wintry national parks, but to my eyes it really gave the whole images a vintage vibe and a special feeling. And also the amount of detail that was recorded both on the black and white and the color negative films was amazing in my opinion. You get a lot of feeling and texture in the images. If you look at the waterfalls or in the stones here in the creeks and so on, there's a lot to be discovered, and that is exactly what I was aiming for and hoping for when shooting with a 6x6 medium format camera. And as I said, I got these images out of a camera that I could easily pocket on a 5-hour hike, going up the mist trail in Yosemite, going very close to the waterfalls, having that mist around myself, and having slippery steps in front of me and so on. And I felt completely comfortable carrying that camera, having it folded away in a pocket in my jacket, and being good to go, and not carrying expensive Hasselblad around my neck or something like that, only to take similar shots eventually. And this is what I really liked, that this whole plan of let's bring 1 additional medium format camera and a couple of rolls of film just for the national parks, that kind of turned out to work out. And that is primarily because of the amazing 80mm lens that this particular camera comes with. Of course, there are some small downsides, and those revolve mostly about shooting directly into sources of light or the sun. So you do get some ghosting and flaring. You can see that here with my shots at Carmel by the Sea or at Sequoia National Park, where the lens naturally created some ghosting and flaring when I really shot into a source of light. But that is understandable, and of course, if I would add a proper lens hood on it. That would certainly help, but it also defeats a little bit the benefits and purpose of having a foldable camera with as little accessories as possible, because as it is now, or was, with just one light meter attached to it and basically being able to open it and close it whenever I want to, once you attach a hood on it, you would have to remove the hood every time you want to close down the camera. And that, of course, is a little bit tricky when you're surrounded by trees that are dripping, melting snow and things like that. That's not the situation where you want to fumble a lot around your camera and do things that take time. I have two photographs where the camera created some scratches on the negatives, which show as lines on one area of the frame, and in one case I even like the effect, and in another case I'm not so happy with it, but it can happen. This is what can happen with such a folding camera and the film advanced mechanism, and of course you really need to make sure that when putting in new film that everything is clean and fine, and that you don't have any other elements in there that could potentially scratch it. And here in my case I was either not careful enough or I had something in the camera and didn't notice it. Either way, it just happened. It's not so bad. Overall I got really nice results and I'm pleased with them. So what about the handling and my personal impressions? Well, we've all heard this old cliche about analog photography slowing you down and being good for your mental health and so on, like it's a contemplative, meditative process and so on. Yes, no news here. And yet this particular camera gives me exactly the right mixture of some thought and slowing me down, and then some convenience like the automatic frame counter and not fussing around too much, and especially if you're shooting at infinity and a few of the elements that would usually be a nuisance like focusing and so on fall away. It can become a very convenient and quick camera. As you can imagine, on such a hike when you can just pull it out, open it up, quickly double check your exposure, cock the shutter, frame and take a shot, and then fold it away again. It's an amazing experience because it makes you super fast and it's very easy to produce 6x6 negatives, capture this amazing scene, stay in the moment and not have a camera that causes you to have to think too much about all the settings and all the stuff that you're doing. And this actually surprised me, that despite this being a purely mechanical and a very manual camera, the small conveniences made sure that it was significantly easier than the Perkeo I to use. And especially in a situation like this, where you are already surrounded sometimes by people, by noisy waterfalls, by things that kind of capture and demand your attention, you can still operate the camera with confidence and ease. And this I really didn't expect to such a degree, and I really enjoyed it. Of course, the camera would be more of a nuisance once you have to take portraits with it and you always need to double check the distance to a subject that is closer. Then it's not as ideal as it was for my particular use case. I get that. As we mentioned before, so if you have the laser with the light and distance meter here by Qi, you can relatively quickly measure the distance, but then you still need to set it on the lens itself, which of course takes time. So it's not something that you could easily and quickly use for quick purposes like that, but when focused at infinity, it's a different story. Another thing that stood out to me was this whole experience of having a more advanced mechanism for advancing the film that is also tied to changing the film and so on. It really takes some practice, and I underestimated this a little bit, because once you're doing this in the national park, when you are surrounded by centuries-old giant trees, and some of the trees happen to be dripping snow, melting snow, and you really want to make sure that nothing is dripping into your open camera, you need to be completely sure what you're doing. You also have gloves on, so you have to remove the gloves, set the levers correctly, put in the film correctly, be quick about it, open up, as it is, the medium format package for the film, put it in, make sure it's advancing properly, close it, look through the window, and then at the right moment, don't forget to change the lever from the right to the left to engage that whole mechanism that starts counting. It all worked fine for me, but in one case I had some problems with the advanced mechanism. For some reason it stopped after 8 or 10 frames. It created problems, and then it was a tricky situation, because that's the moment where you start fumbling around and might create a situation where you're actually damaging the whole advanced mechanism in the camera, because you're in a situation where you want to take more images and the camera kind of prevents you from doing that, and you might not be able to quickly understand it. And I at least had to learn it the hard way, and had to sit down in the evening and then go through it, what was happening, what did I do wrong, and kind of reverse engineer it. And then I fixed the camera and was able to use it the next days again. But this can happen to you, and I would highly encourage to take it out a couple of times before doing such a trip where it really needs to operate and work perfectly fine and reliable. Other than that, I can only repeat what I already said. Please read the manual in this particular case. It's absolutely crucial. Otherwise, you're just bound to have problems with this particular camera. It's way too advanced in terms of its mechanical processes and its operation. Personally, I also liked the feeling of the camera and the weight, and that it was very easy to get used to. Opening it up, closing it down, the two buttons here to close it down also feel very natural at some point. You can also operate it with gloves, more or less. It's not something where you feel like, oh, my gloves, my fingers might be in the way and in front of the lens or something. That sometimes happens with smaller 35mm rangefinders or so. Not in this particular case. I didn't encounter any problems with that, so it was ideal for the purpose at hand, and I can recommend it for that. But as said, I wouldn't do quick street shots or portrait sessions with this particular camera. But if you are out in the nature, want to take fantastic landscape shots, this would be my go-to camera if it needs to be light and accompany you on long hikes in the winter, as in my case. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Analog Insights and my review of the Voigtländer Perkeo II, an amazing compact 6x6 medium format folder camera with a fantastic 80mm lens that really delivers and works particularly well when shooting landscapes at infinity like I did. If you are in the market for this camera, I would highly encourage you to take a very close look at the bellows and whether they are still functioning perfectly fine, they don't have any holes in them. Also check the lens for haze and balsam separation, fog and so on. And also very importantly for the Perkeo II, make sure that the mechanism is still working correctly, this whole automatic frame counter and double exposure prevention mechanism. It is also worth noting that the camera is not really made for testing it without film inside. So ideally you run a film through it if you have a local dealer where you can borrow it for one roll or so. I would always encourage you to do that first before making a purchase. And if you're purchasing it online, you better double check with the seller whether all the mechanisms are still working the way they are supposed to be working. There are some descriptions in the manual of how to test it without film inside that should be followed closely. Please do that, because as I've mentioned before, otherwise it's relatively easy to kind of confuse the mechanism or not use it when not using it as intended. So please stick to the manual, and the description is there, and then it's a beautiful camera that works really well and reliable. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like it and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Jules, Greg, and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.